When people talk about leaving religion, the focus often lands on what they walked away from, but what's less explored and maybe more revealing is what they stepped into afterward. The world doesn't just become empty when someone stops believing, it reshapes itself, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in ways that overturn a person's entire framework for meaning, morality, and identity. Former believers often describe the shift as both unsettling and liberating. One day, a story they had trusted to make sense of suffering, morality, and purpose no longer held its grip, and what followed wasn't a void, but a reconstruction. They began to see the world not as a stage for divine drama, but as a reality that asked to be faced directly without supernatural buffers. That kind of shift changes how people think about ethics, about community, and even about themselves. One of the first adjustments many describe is morality without command. In religion, morality is often presented as a set of divine orders. Do this, avoid that, because a higher authority demands it. Without that authority, many ex-believers expect to feel unmoored, yet what emerges instead is something more flexible and more human. Morality stops being about obedience and starts being about empathy. People recognize that rules don't come from the sky. They come from our need to live together, to reduce harm, to build trust. And once morality is reframed in that way, it feels less arbitrary, not more. It becomes tied to human flourishing rather than divine decree. Another transformation happens in how former believers view meaning. In religion, meaning is often delivered as a packaged story. You're told the world has a beginning, an ending, and a script for your role in between. Leaving that story can feel like losing the only map you've ever known. But slowly, ex-believers realize that maps are not the same as territory, and the territory is richer, more complex, and more open than any narrative could capture. Meaning no longer arrives from above, but is built from below. It grows out of relationships, passions, creativity, and the pursuit of understanding. It's not one grand meaning. It's many smaller ones, stitched together into a life. Psychologists note that this process mirrors something like identity reconstruction. When someone steps out of a religious worldview, it's not just beliefs that change, it's the lens through which every experience is filtered. Former believers often report that they start noticing details of the world they had ignored before. Sunsets are not signs anymore. They are patterns of light scattering in the atmosphere. And strangely enough, that knowledge doesn't cheapen the beauty. It deepens it. A rainbow no longer serves as proof of a covenant, but as the visible spectrum refracted through droplets. And that makes it even more astonishing. Socially, the shift can be difficult. Many ex-believers lose entire networks of friends or even family connections when they step away. But in time, many rebuild. They find communities that don't rely on shared dogma, but on shared humanity. People who connect not because they interpret Scripture the same way, but because they care about one another in practical, down-to-earth terms. For some, this kind of community feels more honest. It doesn't depend on pretending to believe the same thing. It depends on genuine respect and mutual support. One under-discussed element of the post-religious worldview is how it reshapes time. In many faiths, time is seen as a countdown to an ultimate resolution, either a final judgment or a promised paradise or some kind of cosmic ending. Once that framework is gone, time stops being a waiting room for eternity. It becomes finite, fragile, and therefore precious. People who leave belief often describe a new urgency to make their days count. They no longer think of life as a rehearsal for something else. It is the main event, and that recognition makes everyday choices matter more, not less. There's also the way former believers handle uncertainty. In religion, uncertainty is often treated as a threat to faith. Questions must be answered, and doubt must be suppressed. Outside of religion, uncertainty becomes less of a danger and more of a condition of life. Not everything has a final answer, and that's not a defect, that's reality. The post-religious worldview treats uncertainty not as an enemy, but as a teacher. It pushes people to stay curious, to keep learning, to adapt, rather than... This doesn't mean the shift is painless. Letting go of comforting narratives can feel like stepping into cold water. The safety net of eternal justice, cosmic oversight, or guaranteed redemption disappears, but what replaces it is a sturdier kind of resilience, a recognition that meaning, morality, and hope don't have to be borrowed from an invisible authority. They can be constructed moment by moment, choice by choice, through the messy but authentic process of living. And for many ex-believers, that realization is more empowering than anything they had inside religion. Some of the most striking testimonies from former believers come when they describe how they think about suffering after leaving religion. Within many faiths, suffering has an explanation, a divine test, a punishment, or a mystery of higher purpose. But outside of those frameworks, suffering is faced as what it really is, an inevitable part of human existence without cosmic justification. At first, that might sound bleak, yet many who've made the transition say it actually deepens their compassion. If suffering isn't divinely orchestrated, then our response to it matters more. It's on us to alleviate it, to help one another, to create systems that reduce harm. Without a script to justify pain, people often find stronger motivation to ease it. This shift can be seen in everyday actions. A sick child is not a lesson from above, but a medical problem that needs attention. A natural disaster is not divine punishment, but a reminder of our shared vulnerability and the need for solidarity. A person struggling with despair is not failing a spiritual test, but a human being who needs care and connection. The absence of supernatural explanations clears the way for practical, grounded empathy. Another often overlooked transformation is intellectual freedom. Religion tends to come with guardrails, doctrines that cannot be questioned without risking disapproval or worse. Once those guardrails are gone, curiosity is unleashed. Former believers describe the experience like taking off a pair of tinted glasses. Suddenly, they can look at history, science, philosophy, or art without filtering every detail through the lens of what is permitted or forbidden. This freedom doesn't lead to chaos. It leads to exploration. The universe becomes larger, more mysterious, and more inviting when it's not required to fit into a pre-written narrative. For some, this exploration leads to awe that feels even more profound than what they experience inside religion. Looking at the night sky, they no longer think of it as a dome placed above Earth. They think of galaxies, billions of years of stellar evolution, light that has traveled unimaginable distances to reach their eyes. Instead of diminishing wonder, the scientific perspective multiplies it. The idea that stars forge the elements in our bodies turns awe into intimacy. We are not separate from the universe. We are expressions of it. Former believers also talk about how their understanding of death changes. Within religion, death often comes with promises, eternal life, reincarnation, or reunion with lost loved ones. Outside of religion, death is final. It's the end of individual consciousness. That realization is sobering, yet it also sharpens appreciation for the present. The time we have with the people we love is limited. The projects we pursue are temporary, and because of that, they carry weight. A dinner with friends, a walk with a child, a quiet evening alone, these moments become irreplaceable. They are not preludes to eternity. They are eternity in miniature. Sociologists point out that post-religious people often develop what could be called earthly sacredness. It's not sacred in the sense of being decreed from above. It's sacred in the sense of being deeply valued, precisely because it is fragile. Life gains intensity when it's recognized as finite. The small rituals of daily existence and how your conversations, celebrations, even struggles acquire gravity when they are seen as the only versions we will ever have. There's also the question of responsibility. In religious systems, responsibility is often shared with God. Humans act, but divine will is always considered the ultimate force behind outcomes. When that layer is removed, responsibility lands more squarely on us. At first, that weight can feel heavy, but it also empowers. If the future isn't in the hands of a deity, then our choices genuinely matter. Building just societies, preserving the environment, reducing inequality, These aren't side concerns while waiting for heaven. They are the central tasks of being human here and now. One of the more obscure but fascinating effects of leaving religion is how people reevaluate history. When you're inside of faith, history often looks like a series of divine interventions, revelations, miracles, battles ordained by God. But once that framing dissolves, history becomes a human story, messy, complicated, full of errors and experiments. Instead of looking for supernatural meaning, ex-believers start to appreciate the courage, creativity, and failures of people who built the world we inherit. This doesn't make history less inspiring. It makes it more relatable. Our ancestors weren't pawns in a divine plan. They were humans like us, figuring things out in difficult circumstances and sometimes stumbling toward progress. The post-religious worldview also changes how people think about knowledge itself. In religious systems, truth is often something handed down, fixed, eternal, unquestionable. Outside of that, truth is provisional, open to revision, tested against evidence. Some might think that makes it weaker, but in practice, it makes it stronger. Knowledge that survives questioning and testing is more reliable than knowledge protected from doubt. Former believers often say they feel more intellectually honest after leaving. They no longer have to defend claims they can't support. Instead, they can say, "I don't know." And that's not a failure. It's the beginning of inquiry. This shift toward intellectual honesty can even affect creativity. Writers, artists, musicians who step away from faith often describe how their work opens up. No longer bound to religious themes or taboos, they explore the full spectrum of human experience. Love, loss, absurdity, joy, injustice, all of it becomes raw material for expression. Creativity doesn't shrink outside of religion. It expands. And the art that emerges often speaks more universally because it doesn't rely on insider beliefs. All of these elements, morality without command, meaning without script, awe without mythology, responsibility without divine backup, form a mosaic of the post-religious worldview. It's not one single system. It varies from person to person, shaped by culture, personality, and experience. But across the differences, a common thread runs through: a willingness to face reality as it is, without insisting that it match a story we've inherited. That willingness is not a loss, it's a gain. One important area where former believers often notice change is in how they deal with authority. Inside religion, authority is usually centralized. Scriptures, leaders, traditions, all demanding loyalty. After stepping out, many begin to see authority differently. They stop assuming that just because someone speaks with confidence or claims sacred knowledge, they must be right. Instead, authority has to earn its place through evidence, transparency, and accountability. This shift carries over into politics, work, and relationships. Ex-believers often become more skeptical of anyone who demands obedience without justification. That skepticism isn't destructive, it's protective. It helps guard against manipulation and abuse. Many who leave religion realize how easily trust can be misused when people are conditioned to obey. And with that realization comes a commitment to question power wherever it appears, not out of cynicism, but out of a sense of responsibility. If someone is asking for loyalty, they should also be willing to explain themselves. Another layer of the post-religious worldview is how people relate to doubt. Within many faiths, doubt is treated as weakness, even as a moral failing. But once outside, doubt transforms. It becomes a tool, a compass, a way of testing ideas before investing in them. Former believers often describe how liberating it is to no longer fear doubt. They can let questions stand. They can let uncertainty breathe. And instead of destabilizing them, it strengthens them because the answers they do arrive at feel earned, not imposed. On a psychological level, researchers find that leaving religion often reshapes people's relationship with themselves. In faith traditions, there can be a constant background hum of guilt or unworthiness. The sense that no matter what you do, you're never enough. Once that framework is gone, many ex-believers begin to feel a new kind of self-acceptance. They're not weighed down by the idea of being inherently flawed or needing forgiveness from a supernatural judge. Instead, they see themselves as imperfect but capable humans, learning as they go. That kind of self-regard can be healing. It doesn't erase mistakes, but it allows growth without the weight of eternal condemnation. There's also a shift in how former believers view morality across cultures. In many religions, morality is often tied tightly to one tradition. Outside of that, morality starts to look more like a shared human project. People notice patterns: compassion, fairness, reciprocity, showing up in societies with very different beliefs. They realize morality doesn't need a divine source to be real. It's part of how communities survive and thrive. This recognition often leads to greater tolerance. Instead of dividing the world into insiders and outsiders, ex-believers start seeing the variety of moral systems as different responses to the same human needs. One striking observation is how many describe a newfound sense of freedom around their bodies and identities. Religious teachings often impose strict rules about sexuality, gender, clothing, and roles. When those rules fall away, people begin to explore who they are without fear of breaking divine commands. For some, this leads to healthier relationships, more honest self-expression, and less shame. They stop treating natural human desires as sins and start seeing them as parts of life to be understood and navigated. That freedom isn't just about personal identity. It extends to how people interact with culture. Former believers often say they feel more comfortable engaging with art, music, film, or literature that was once off limits. Instead of asking whether something aligns with doctrine, they ask whether it challenges them, moves them, or reveals something about the human condition. Cultural engagement becomes richer because it's guided by curiosity rather than fear of contamination. Another subtle shift comes in how ex-believers think about progress. Within many faiths, the world is viewed as deteriorating until some final redemption. But outside of that framework, progress becomes a human task, not a divine one. History shows advances in medicine, rights, knowledge, and technology, not because of divine intervention, but because people worked for them. That recognition can inspire action. If we want the world to improve, we have to build it ourselves. This sense of agency feeds into how former believers approach future generations. Instead of seeing children as souls to be saved, they see them as humans to be nurtured. Education and critical thinking, emotional resilience, these become priorities, and the goal shifts from preparing children for another world to equipping them for this one. And that shift is profound, and it changes how parents raise their kids, how teachers guide their students, and how societies think about youth. There's a deeper irony here. Many who leave religion report that they actually develop a stronger sense of gratitude. At first glance, that seems backwards. Gratitude is often tied to giving thanks to a deity. But in a post-religious worldview, gratitude takes a different shape. It's not about thanking an unseen being. It's about recognizing the sheer improbability of existing at all. It's about appreciating the chain of people, choices, and accidents that made life possible. Gratitude no longer points upward. It radiates outward toward family, friends, communities, and even strangers whose labor makes daily life possible. The more this worldview develops, the more it creates a new kind of reverence, not for the supernatural, but for the ordinary. The taste of food, the sound of laughter, the resilience of people facing hardship, these become sources of awe. And in that sense, former believers don't lose reverence, they relocate it. One of the more surprising aspects of life after belief is how people relate to forgiveness. In many religious systems, forgiveness is mediated by a divine figure. People are told that true reconciliation requires appealing to a higher power. Outside of that framework, forgiveness becomes a human-to-human process. It's no longer about erasing sins before eternity. It's about repairing relationships in the here and now. Former believers often say this makes forgiveness feel more authentic. It doesn't rest on supernatural absolution, but on honesty, accountability, and change. This shift also alters how people approach justice. Religious teachings sometimes encourage waiting for divine judgment to settle wrongs. But in a post-religious worldview, waiting is not enough. If harm is to be addressed, humans must take responsibility. That means building systems that are fair, reducing suffering where possible, and recognizing that perfection will never be reached, but improvement always can. Justice stops being deferred to the next world and becomes a project for this one. The same applies to how ex-believers think about promises of reward. In many faiths, moral action is tied to future benefits, paradise, blessings, eternal life. Without those incentives, morality could seem less motivating, but what often happens is the opposite. Former believers discover that helping others, telling the truth, or acting with kindness has value in itself. Not because it earns points for later, but because it shapes the quality of life now. Actions are no longer weighed by how they impress an invisible judge. They're measured by how they affect real people. Another often underappreciated change comes in how former believers relate to nature. In religious narratives, nature is often seen as a backdrop for human drama or as property granted for human use. Outside that view, nature is recognized as an interconnected system that sustains us. Forests, oceans, and ecosystems stop being secondary and start being central. Many ex-believers report a stronger sense of environmental responsibility once they no longer see the Earth as a temporary stage destined for destruction. The planet becomes home, not a waiting room, and this home becomes richer the more closely it's studied. Instead of viewing animals as created solely for human benefit, people begin to see them as fellow creatures with their own complex behaviors and needs. Instead of viewing natural disasters as divine signs, they recognize them as reminders of our shared vulnerability. That recognition often builds humility, a recognition that humans are not the center of everything, but participants in a much larger system of life. This humility ties back into how people view human achievement. When former believers look at technology, medicine, or art, they no longer see it as gifts dropped from above. They see it as the product of human creativity, trial and error, collaboration, and persistence. That realization doesn't diminish the achievement. It amplifies it, because it shows how much is possible when people rely on one another rather than waiting for miracles. There's also an interesting psychological shift that researchers note. People who leave belief often experience what's called existential maturity. It's the capacity to hold both the beauty and tragedy of life without needing ultimate guarantees. This maturity allows people to live with complexity. They accept that joy and loss, growth and decay, love and grief are woven together. They don't need a final chapter where everything is explained or made fair. They find dignity in facing the story as it unfolds without certainty of how it ends. This maturity often leads to a deeper sense of solidarity. Former believers realize that if there is no divine referee, then our common struggles unite us even more. The pain of loss, the fear of death, the search for purpose, these are shared across cultures and histories. Instead of dividing the world into chosen and condemned insiders and outsiders, they see everyone as fellow travelers. The recognition fosters empathy across boundaries that religion sometimes reinforced. It also encourages a more nuanced view of happiness. Inside faith, happiness can be framed as obedience or alignment with divine will. Outside, happiness is understood as more fluid. It's not a permanent state, but a shifting balance of meaning, connection, and engagement. Former believers often describe it less as a prize to be earned and more as a practice to be cultivated. And that practice includes not just pleasure, but resilience, honesty, and care for others. Even the way ex-believers think about failure changes. Within religion, failure often carries eternal weight. A mistake might be seen as sin, requiring repentance and forgiveness from beyond. Without that framework, failure is reframed. It's still painful, but it becomes part of learning, a signal, not a sentence. Mistakes don't mark someone forever. They become stepping stones in the long, unfinished process of growth. This shift often reduces shame and increases resilience. All of these changes in morality, justice, nature, solidarity, happiness, failure accumulate over time, and together they form a worldview that doesn't feel like emptiness. It feels like expansions. Life doesn't shrink after religion, it widens. The colors of experience grow sharper, the stakes feel more immediate, and the connections to others feel more vital. For ex-believers, that is the essence of their post-religious perspective. Not the absence of meaning, but the rediscovery of it in places they once overlooked. Another area where the post-religious perspective stands out is in how people think about truth. In religion, truth is often delivered as something finished, a completed package handed down, protected from challenge. But once outside of that structure, truth is recognized as something provisional, always subject to revision. For ex-believers, this doesn't weaken truth, it strengthens it. Because when a claim survives questioning, it's not because it's untouchable, but because it's been tested. Truth becomes less about defending dogma and more about discovering reality. This discovery-based approach often transforms how people see science. Inside faith, science can sometimes be treated as a threat or as something that must fit within sacred narratives. Outside, science becomes a method for uncovering the unknown. It's not a rival to meaning, but a companion to curiosity. Former believers often describe feeling awe in scientific explanations, not because they provide final certainty, but because they show how much remains to be explored. Every new answer opens new questions, and that cycle keeps wonder alive. The post-religious worldview also changes how people use language. Religious environments often fill speech with sacred phrases, blessings, or coded references that mark insiders from outsiders. Once those are gone, people notice how much clearer and more direct language becomes. Communication shifts from formula to authenticity. Instead of repeating words they're expected to say, ex-believers begin speaking more honestly. That honesty can be disorienting at first, but over time, it builds stronger trust. Trust itself becomes a central theme. Within religion, trust is often directed upward, placed in divine providence. Outside, trust is reoriented toward people and systems. Former believers learn to trust evidence, processes, and human relationships. They stop waiting for invisible protection and start building practical safety nets with others. This doesn't erase disappointment. People fail, systems break, but it grounds trust in the real instead of the imagined. And that kind of trust, though imperfect, is more reliable. Another change is in how people handle fear. In many religious contexts, fear is tied to eternal stakes, hell, judgment, divine anger. Leaving that framework doesn't remove fear from life, but it transforms it. Fear is no longer about cosmic punishment. It's about tangible risks, illness, poverty, injustice, loss. These fears are real, but they're also manageable. They can be faced, prepared for, mitigated. Ex-believers often say this makes them more resilient. They're not paralyzed by the terror of unseen forces. They're focused on what they can control. Community takes on new meaning too. Inside religion, community is often tied to shared beliefs. Once someone leaves, they might lose that structure. But over time, many build communities that are more diverse and less fragile. Instead of being united by doctrine, they're united by shared values, mutual respect, or common goals. These communities tend to be more inclusive. People don't have to agree on metaphysics to cooperate, celebrate, or support one another. That kind of community can feel more stable because it's based on choice rather than conformity. There's also a shift in how people see history and culture. Without religious filters, art and literature that once seemed threatening become sources of richness. Myths, scriptures, and rituals are no longer binding truths, but cultural artifacts. They're studied, appreciated, critiqued, not worshipped. Former believers can see them as part of humanity's long struggle to make sense of existence. And by doing so, they gain a deeper appreciation of how far human thought has come and how much it continues to evolve. The way ex-believers see diversity changes too. In religion, differences can be framed as errors or threats. Outside of that, Diversity often becomes something to value. Different cultures, perspectives, and lifestyles are no longer judged against a single standard of truth. They're seen as experiments in living, not all equally successful, but all revealing something about what it means to be human. That recognition encourages openness rather than defensiveness. This openness extends to ethics as well. In religion, ethics is often framed as obeying divine rules. Once those rules are gone, ethics becomes more experimental. It's about asking what works, what harms, what helps. It's about adjusting as new knowledge arises. That doesn't make it arbitrary. It makes it adaptive. Former believers often describe feeling more responsible for ethical decisions because there's no appeal to authority. The choices are theirs and the consequences are real. All of these changes contribute to a different kind of hope. In religion, hope is often tied to promised futures beyond this world. Outside, hope becomes grounded in the present and near future. Hope is not about paradise after death. It's about better schools, fairer laws, healthier relationships, cleaner air. It's about the work that can be done here and now. That kind of hope may be less grand in scale, but it's more actionable. It depends not on prophecy, but on effort. And for many who leave belief, that hope feels more satisfying. Because it doesn't require faith, it requires engagement. It's not given, it's built. One of the most powerful areas where the post-religious perspective shows itself is in how people think about identity. Inside religion, identity is often tightly bound to belief. You're defined by your membership, your faith, your rituals. Once outside, identity becomes less about labels handed down and more about choices. Former believers describe feeling like they can finally explore who they are without the constant pressure of fitting a mold. That doesn't mean identity becomes easy. It's complex and evolving, but it feels more authentic. This authenticity often comes with a clearer sense of boundaries. Many who leave religion say they learn to separate their own voice from the voice of authority they once internalized. They no longer feel the need to justify every decision with reference to sacred texts or leaders. Instead, they ask, does this align with my values, my understanding, and my experience? That internal shift can be transformative. It's the difference between living under surveillance and living with self-awareness. At the same time, former believers often develop a more realistic view of human psychology. Without attributing everything to sin or virtue, they start to see human behavior as shaped by biology, environment, and circumstance. This doesn't excuse harmful actions, but it explains them in ways that invite solutions rather than condemnation. Addiction, for example, is no longer seen as a moral failing, but as a health issue. Conflict is no longer seen as evidence of spiritual battle, but as the clash of needs, misunderstandings, or systemic flaws. This shift leads to more practical responses, policies, therapy, education, instead of moral panic. The post-religious worldview also influences how people think about ritual. For many, leaving faith means leaving behind religious ceremonies. But over time, they often rediscover the human need for ritual in new forms. Birthdays, memorials, graduations, even simple gatherings with friends. These become moments of symbolic meaning. Ritual doesn't disappear, it transforms. It's no longer about appeasing a deity, but about marking transitions, expressing gratitude, and strengthening bonds. Another area of transformation is art. Religion often dictates what art is acceptable and what is forbidden. Without those constraints, ex-believers often report a new openness to artistic expression. They explore music, film, painting, and literature without fear of offending divine standards. This freedom allows them to encounter perspectives they might have once avoided. And through that, art becomes a tool not of indoctrination, but of exploration. There's also a shift in how people experience silence and solitude. In religion, silence is often framed as waiting for a divine voice. When that expectation is gone, silence takes on a different quality. It becomes space for reflection, for simply being. Former believers often describe learning to sit with themselves in a way they never did before. Not listening for something beyond, but listening to the present moment. That kind of silence can be grounding. It helps cultivate a deeper awareness of life as it is. The sense of mortality also changes in subtle ways. In faith, death is often softened by the promise of continuation. Outside of that, the finality of death becomes unavoidable. Yet many ex-believers say this finality gives life sharper edges. It forces clarity about priorities. If time is limited, what do you want to spend it on? What matters most? This urgency can be unsettling, but it's also energizing. It reminds people that postponing joy, growth, or love in the name of preparing for another world may waste the only world we truly have. On a social level, the post-religious perspective can foster stronger appreciation for diversity in thought. Without needing everyone to agree on theology, ex-believers often feel more comfortable with disagreement. They can have conversations with people from different backgrounds without the anxiety of defending sacred truths. This openness can lead to richer dialogues and a more flexible worldview. Differences stop being threats, they become opportunities to learn. Economically and politically, this worldview has ripple effects. When divine authority is no longer seen as the foundation of law or order, people turn to human reasoning, evidence, and debate. That doesn't mean solutions become simple, far from it, but it means decisions can be tested, revised, and improved without waiting for revelation. This flexibility can make societies more adaptable. Problems are not solved by prayer alone, but by policy, innovation, and cooperation. All of these shifts add up to something deeper than just disbelief. They add up to a worldview rooted in responsibility, awareness, and resilience. For ex-believers, the absence of religious certainty doesn't leave them lost. It leaves them free to face reality on its own terms, and to build meaning not from decrees, but from living. And that is what makes the post-religious perspective not just a negation, but a reconstruction. One theme that often emerges in conversations with former believers is resilience. Inside religion, resilience is sometimes framed as trust in divine providence. Outside, resilience comes from facing reality directly. People learn that they can endure hardship not because a higher power guarantees a good outcome, but because human beings have remarkable capacities for adaptation and support. This recognition can be empowering. It shifts the focus from waiting for rescue to building strength within and among ourselves. Resilience is also tied to creativity. Many ex-believers find that once they are no longer bound by rigid interpretations of life, they begin experimenting with new ways of living. They explore philosophies, practices, and ideas that were once off limits. Some embrace mindfulness, others turn to philosophy or literature, some throw themselves into activism or science. The absence of one narrative opens the door to many, and while this abundance can feel overwhelming, it also allows for richer, more personalized paths forward. Another striking shift is in how people think about community responsibility. In religious settings, charity and service are often encouraged but tied to spiritual reward. Once outside, then the motivation changes. Helping others is not a way to please a deity. It's a way to recognize our shared vulnerability. Acts of kindness and justice are no longer framed as duties imposed from above, but as choices that shape the quality of collective life. This makes responsibility feel less like obligation and more like opportunity. The post-religious worldview also reshapes how people view failure at a societal level. In religious contexts, the world's problems may be explained as part of a fallen creation or divine plan. Outside, failure is understood as a result of human error, ignorance, or neglect. And because of that, solutions become possible. If poverty, inequality, or violence are not faded, then they can be reduced. They may not disappear, but they can be changed through effort. This belief in human agency, though fragile, can be a powerful driver of progress. Education often takes on new importance for ex-believers. Without reliance on sacred texts as ultimate authority, they turn to schools, universities, and self-study as sources of growth. They begin to see knowledge not as dangerous, but as liberating. Libraries and classrooms become places of discovery rather than threats to faith. This shift often leads to deeper appreciation for teachers, mentors, and thinkers who expand horizons. In many cases, former believers describe a second kind of awakening, not just leaving faith, but finding joy in learning. And with that awakening comes humility, the recognition that no single person or tradition holds all answers. This humility doesn't mean surrender. It means openness, a willingness to admit limits and remain curious. Former believers often say that they feel less pressure to have all the answers and more freedom to ask better questions. That mindset, in turn, fosters patience with others on their own journeys. Relationships also evolve. And in religious settings, relationships can sometimes be framed through shared doctrine or expectations. Outside relationships stand on their own. Trust, communication, affection, these become the true foundations. Former believers often report that their friendships and partnerships feel more honest once they are not bound by shared belief but by genuine connection. And while losing old networks can be painful, the relationships that grow afterward often feel sturdier because they are chosen, not imposed. Even the concept of love changes. Within religion, love is often tied to commandments or divine example. Outside, love becomes something deeply human, fragile, imperfect, but real. It's not proof of a cosmic plan. It's the bond that helps people survive and thrive. Former believers often say this makes love feel more meaningful. It's not guaranteed. It's not eternal. It's not a test. It's simply one of the most profound ways we experience being alive. The post-religious perspective also invites a more realistic approach to conflict. Instead of seeing disagreements as battles between good and evil, ex-believers learn to recognize them as differences in perspective, interests, or knowledge. This doesn't make conflict vanish, but it makes it easier to navigate. Solutions don't require conversion. They require compromise, dialogue, or structural change. This shift can make societies more stable because disagreements are no longer treated as threats to sacred order, but as challenges to be worked through. At its heart, this worldview is less about what is absent and more about what is gained. The gain of intellectual honesty, the gain of authentic relationships, and the gain of grounded responsibility, the gain of wonder without myth. These gains accumulate until what once seemed like loss and leaving behind belief begins to feel like expansion into a wider, more vivid world. One area where the shift is especially profound is in how former believers think about purpose. Inside religion, purpose is usually pre-written. You're told why you exist, what your role is, and where your story ends. Once outside, that script is gone. At first, this can feel like disorientation, a loss of the compass that guided every step. But gradually, many discover that not having a fixed purpose doesn't mean having none. It means you can create your own purpose, stops being dictated, and starts being constructed. That construction looks different for each person. Some find it in raising children, some in art, some in science, some in activism. Others find it in quieter pursuits, gardening, teaching, traveling, building friendships. The key is that purpose is not handed down, it's chosen. And because it's chosen, it often feels more authentic. It reflects who a person really is, not who they were told to be. This freedom to choose purpose also changes how people view success. In religious contexts, success can be defined in terms of faithfulness, obedience, or alignment with divine law. Outside of that, success becomes more flexible. It's not measured by spiritual purity, but by whether life feels meaningful, whether goals are pursued honestly, whether relationships flourish. This makes success less about meeting external standards and more about living in alignment with personal values. Former believers also describe a shift in how they think about time and urgency. When eternity is no longer part of the picture, the present gains more importance. Procrastination feels different when you recognize that life is finite. Opportunities, once thought to be repeatable in some eternal framework, are recognized as unique. This awareness can drive people to act with more intention, to repair relationships, to pursue goals, to savor experiences. Interestingly, many ex-believers say this awareness doesn't make them despair. It makes them cherish. A single day with loved ones feels more precious when you know it's finite. A single act of kindness feels weightier when you know it might ripple in ways you'll never see. Far from making life meaningless, finitude gives it texture. It sharpens the edges of experience, and this recognition of finitude also reshapes how people think about legacy. In religious terms, legacy often means storing up treasures in heaven or leaving behind spiritual influence. Outside of that, legacy is seen in more tangible ways, and the lives touched, the contributions made, the kindness shown. It's not about eternal record keeping. It's about the memories and effects that endure in the real world after someone is gone. Former believers often say this makes legacy feel more honest. It's not about cosmic judgment, it's about human impact. The way people view morality continues to evolve in subtle ways too. Without eternal punishment or reward, morality might seem less binding. But in practice, many find it more urgent, because if harm isn't balanced in another world, it must be addressed here. If kindness isn't eternally rewarded, it must be valued for its immediate effect. Morality becomes less about rule following and more about responsibility. That responsibility feels heavier but also more empowering. Another under-discussed effect of leaving religion is the way it changes imagination. Many assume religion fuels imagination through stories, symbols, and rituals, but outside of it, imagination doesn't disappear. It expands. It's no longer confined to what's permitted by doctrine. People can imagine futures without fearing they contradict prophecy. They can imagine alternative ways of living without being told they are forbidden. This freedom of imagination often translates into greater creativity in art, science, and everyday problem solving. Former believers also talk about humor. Inside religion, humor can be restricted. Certain topics are off limits. Certain jokes considered dangerous, and outside, humor becomes more expansive, like it can poke fun at authority, at human absurdity, at the randomness of existence. Laughter becomes a tool for resilience, a way to face the strangeness of life without fear. Many describe how liberating it feels to laugh at things they once treated with untouchable seriousness. Finally, there's the question of wonder. Many assume leaving faith reduces wonder, but the opposite is often true. Wonder becomes more raw, more immediate. It's not tied to supernatural explanations, but to the sheer strangeness of reality. The idea that consciousness arises from matter, that stars explode to create the elements of our bodies, that evolution shapes every living thing, and these truths spark awe without needing divine narratives. Wonder becomes not something handed down, but something discovered anew every day. For ex-believers, all of this adds up to a way of seeing that doesn't erase the human need for meaning, connection, and awe. It simply grounds those needs in reality. It accepts that the universe may not care, but we do, and that caring, fragile, imperfect, fleeting, is enough to build lives worth living. One dimension of the post-religious worldview that deserves attention is how it reframes responsibility for knowledge. Within religion, truth is often considered received, a gift or revelation. Once outside, truth becomes something earned. Knowledge requires effort, reading, experimenting, comparing perspectives. This makes learning feel more active. Instead of waiting for answers, ex-believers pursue them. They become participants in discovery rather than passive recipients of doctrine. This pursuit of knowledge often leads to a stronger appreciation of uncertainty. In religion, uncertainty is framed as a problem to be solved by faith. Outside, uncertainty is recognized as inevitable and even valuable. Former believers learn to say, "I don't know," without fear. They accept that some mysteries will remain unsolved and that this doesn't weaken their worldview, but makes it more honest. Uncertainty, instead of being erased, becomes a companion to curiosity. The post-religious perspective also reshapes how people think about authority figures beyond religion. Political leaders, experts, even family members are no longer automatically trusted just because they hold a position. Respect has to be earned through transparency, honesty, and accountability. This doesn't mean rejecting all authority. It means evaluating it. Former believers often report feeling more confident in questioning claims, asking for evidence, and refusing blind obedience. This skepticism, while sometimes uncomfortable, helps protect against manipulation. Another striking change is how people experience belonging. Religious communities often provide a sense of belonging tied to shared belief. Leaving can create painful isolation, but many ex-believers discover new forms of belonging. Groups built around common interests, shared goals, or mutual respect rather than shared dogma. These bonds often feel more resilient. They don't depend on agreement about metaphysics, but on trust and care. Belonging stops being conditional on belief and starts being based on genuine human connection. Former believers also notice a transformation in how they approach moral disagreement. In religious settings, disagreements can escalate quickly because they're tied to eternal truths. Outside, moral disagreements are still serious, but they're not absolute. They become discussions about consequences, evidence, and empathy. Instead of asking, what does God say? The question becomes, what reduces harm? What increases fairness? What helps people flourish? This shift doesn't erase conflict, but it makes dialogue more possible. There's also a profound difference in how former believers view gratitude. Gratitude inside religion often points upward. Outside, it points outward to the people who grow food, build infrastructure, provide care, create art, or simply share kindness. Gratitude becomes less about unseen forces and more about visible networks. This grounded form of gratitude often deepens social bonds. It highlights interdependence rather than divine favor. Another layer is how former believers see mortality and grief. In religion, grief is softened by promises of reunion or eternal life. Without those promises, grief can feel sharper, but many describe it as more honest. Mourning becomes a way of honoring the reality of loss rather than denying it. And paradoxically, this honesty can bring deeper comfort because it validates the weight of the relationship. The love was real, the loss is real, and the grief honors both. This honesty also affects how ex-believers celebrate. Without the promise of eternity, celebrations take on more urgency. Birthdays, weddings, milestones. These are recognized as irreplaceable moments, not rehearsals for something greater, but the substance of life itself. Former believers often say these celebrations feel more vivid because they're not symbolic of eternity, but concrete acknowledgments of finite joy. The post-religious worldview also influences how people think about morality across generations. Instead of focusing on spiritual inheritance, ex-believers think about practical legacies: education, environment, culture, health. What matters is not saving souls, but improving lives. That shift often leads to long-term thinking about sustainability, justice, and equity. The future becomes something to build, not something predetermined. Taken together, these shifts show why the post-religious perspective is not simply the absence of belief. It's the reorientation of life toward reality as it is, toward responsibility, empathy, curiosity, and creativity. Former believers don't just lose a story, they gain the freedom to write their own. Another area where the post-religious worldview reveals its strength is in how people relate to progress. Within many religious traditions, history is often framed as decline until divine intervention or as a countdown to an ultimate climax. Outside of that framework, progress is seen as something humans create step by step. Ex-believers often describe a stronger sense of agency when they realize improvements in medicine, human rights, or technology are not gifts from beyond but achievements of collective effort. This makes progress feel more fragile, but also more valuable because it depends on us. This recognition also shapes how people see responsibility for the future. When salvation or apocalypse is no longer expected, the focus shifts to practical stewardship. Climate change, poverty, inequality, these challenges cannot be solved by prophecy. They require policy, innovation, and cooperation. Former believers often say that leaving faith made them more invested in real-world solutions because they no longer believe the world is disposable or destined for destruction. Education takes on a sharper role too. Without sacred texts as final answers, education becomes the means by which societies navigate the unknown. Former believers often describe feeling re-energized about learning, whether through formal study or self-directed curiosity. Books, documentaries, and conversations stop being filtered through fear of heresy and start being approached with openness. This shift can feel like moving from a narrow hallway into an expansive landscape. Art and culture are also transformed. Sacred restrictions that once defined what could be read, watched, or created no longer apply. Ex-believers often find themselves exploring music, film, and literature they once avoided, and discovering insights that resonate on a human level. Instead of asking whether art aligns with doctrine, they ask whether it challenges, moves, or enriches. Art becomes less about serving dogma and more about expressing human truth. There's also a notable change in how former believers experience awe in everyday life. Awe is no longer tied to miracles or divine acts. It arises from the ordinary. A child learning language, the complexity of ecosystems, the beauty of mathematics. Many describe this as a deeper awe because it doesn't require suspending disbelief. It's grounded in what actually is. The more they learn, the more astonishing reality becomes. Another transformation comes in how people relate to moral failure. In religion, moral failure is often tied to eternal consequences. Outside of that, failure is recognized as part of being human, can be confronted, repaired, and learned from without being treated as permanent condemnation. This perspective often makes people more compassionate both toward themselves and toward others. Mistakes are not proof of damnation, and they're invitations to growth. Community bonds evolve too. Ex-believers often rebuild social networks on the basis of authenticity rather than conformity. These communities may be smaller at first, but they tend to feel stronger. People don't stay because they fear exclusion from eternity. They stay because they genuinely value the connections. And these bonds often extend across differences because shared humanity becomes the unifying element instead of shared creed. Former believers also develop new ways of thinking about ritual. Even if they no longer practice religious ceremonies, they often create secular rituals that mark important transitions, memorials, seasonal gatherings, personal milestones. Ritual doesn't vanish. It adapts. It becomes less about divine command and more about human expression. And in that adaptation, it retains its power to bind communities and give meaning to time. One of the less discussed but powerful effects of this worldview is its relationship with humor and humility. Without fear of blasphemy, humor becomes freer. People can laugh at the absurdity of life, at themselves, at the strangeness of existence, and humility grows as well. Not the humility of submission to divine authority, but the humility of recognizing how small we are in the vastness of the universe. Both humor and humility become tools for resilience, helping people face reality without despair. What emerges then is not a worldview of emptiness, but one of reconstruction. Former believers don't just walk away from religion. They build new ways of seeing, relating, and creating. And the picture that emerges is not bleak. It's textured, vibrant, and deeply human. One of the subtler but profound changes for ex-believers is how they relate to doubt and curiosity. Inside religion, doubt often carries stigma. It's treated as weakness or even rebellion. Outside, doubt becomes a natural companion to curiosity. Instead of fearing it, people lean into it, and they learn that questions don't have to be resolved instantly, that sitting with uncertainty can open the door to deeper understanding. Doubt stops being a crack in faith and starts being a doorway to growth. This shift alters how people approach conversations too. In religious communities, dialogue can sometimes feel like debate over absolute truth, but once freed from that framework, discussions become less about winning and more about exploring. Former believers often describe how liberating it feels to talk with others without having to defend sacred positions. They can listen more openly, challenge more honestly, and walk away without feeling that someone's soul is at stake. Conversations gain depth because they are no longer burdened by eternal consequences. The post-religious perspective also brings a different way of handling mistakes. In many faiths, mistakes are framed as sins, and the remedy involves confession, repentance, or ritual. Outside, mistakes are recognized as errors to be corrected through accountability and change. This doesn't make them trivial, but it removes the weight of supernatural judgment. People can apologize, repair, and move forward without carrying invisible debts. This approach often strengthens relationships because reconciliation is based on human honesty rather than divine mediation. Another transformation occurs in how people perceive authority within families. Religious teachings often prescribe strict hierarchies of parent and child, husband and wife. Without those structures, families can renegotiate their dynamics on the basis of respect and consent. Parenting, for example, becomes less about enforcing spiritual conformity and more about nurturing autonomy. Children are encouraged to ask questions, explore, and develop their own values. This doesn't eliminate challenges, but it creates space for healthier growth. The sense of responsibility expands into global awareness as well. When belief systems no longer frame the world as divided into chosen and condemned, ex-believers often become more sensitive to global issues. Poverty in another country is no longer seen as part of a divine plan. It's recognized as a human problem demanding human solutions. This shift can foster greater solidarity across borders as people see themselves less as members of competing faiths and more as members of a shared humanity. Another notable change is how people experience silence and solitude. Without expecting a divine voice to answer, silence becomes less about waiting and more about presence. Former believers often describe learning to appreciate quiet moments simply for what they are: walking in nature, sitting with a book, reflecting without agenda. This change may sound small, but it can profoundly alter one's relationship with self and world. Silence is no longer empty. It is full of awareness. The way people think about mortality deepens over time too. Once the idea of eternal life fades, death becomes final. And while this recognition can feel harsh, it also sharpens perspective. Former believers often say that knowing life is finite pushes them to live more fully. It encourages reconciliation with loved ones, pursuit of meaningful work, and savoring of small joys. Mortality, rather than being something to deny, becomes a teacher of urgency and gratitude. This gratitude often extends beyond personal life to appreciation for collective achievements. Public health, scientific breakthroughs, human rights movements, these are not taken for granted but recognized as fragile victories. Former believers often feel more motivated to protect and expand them because they know these achievements are not guaranteed. They are the result of effort, and they can be lost if neglected. Gratitude becomes an incentive to action. Over time, the post-religious worldview matures into something steady, not a constant battle against belief, but a calm acceptance of reality as it is. For many ex-believers, the journey begins in conflict and ends in clarity. They no longer feel the need to fight every doctrine or prove every point. Instead, they simply live in a way that reflects their values, confident that meaning, morality, and wonder can exist without divine scripts. And in that confidence, they find a kind of peace